The Moonweaver's Garden. In the valley where time moves like honey through bamboo leaves, there lived a peculiar soul named Whisperwind Moonweaver. Her cottage sat nestled between two ancient willows, whose branches seemed to dance with secrets older than memory itself. Each evening, as the sun melted into the horizon like golden butter on warm bread, Whisperwind would tend to her extraordinary garden. This was no ordinary garden. Instead of flowers, she cultivated moments of peace. Instead of vegetables, she grew understanding. The soil was made of discarded worries, composted into rich earth that nourished tranquility. Her neighbors often wondered how she managed to remain so serene while the world around them spun with endless concerns and restless thoughts. Whisperwind had learned long ago that stress was like a wild horse. The more you tried to control it with force, the more it would buck and resist. Instead, she had discovered the art of gentle acknowledgement. When anxiety came galloping into her awareness, she would simply nod to it, as she might greet an old acquaintance passing on the street. Tonight, as fireflies began their ancient dance among the jasmine vines, Whisperwind noticed a small sparrow with ruffled feathers perched on her garden gate. The bird's tiny chest rose and fell rapidly, its eyes darting nervously from shadow to shadow. She recognized the signs immediately. This little creature carried the same burden that visited humans so frequently, the weight of tomorrow's worries and yesterday's regrets. Approaching slowly, Whisperwind began to hum a melody that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. The tune had no beginning and promised no end, flowing like water, finding its natural course down a hillside. The sparrow's rapid breathing began to slow, matching the rhythm of her gentle song. "Little friend," she whispered, her voice barely disturbing the evening air. "You carry tomorrow's sunrise in your wings, before today's sunset has even finished painting the sky. Why burden yourself with flights not yet taken?" The sparrow tilted its head, as if considering her words. Whisperwind continued her humming, while she moved through her garden, tending to the patches where peace grew strongest. She plucked a few sprigs of dried lavender, not the purple herb, but the metaphysical kind that bloomed from released expectations. As she worked, Whisperwind shared the wisdom that her grandmother's grandmother had passed down through generations of moonweavers. "Stress," she murmured to the night air, "and her small feathered friend is simply energy that has forgotten how to flow. Like a river that encounters a boulder, it crashes and froths and makes much noise. But water, patient water, always finds a way around, under, or over any obstacle." The sparrow hopped closer, no longer trembling. In the growing darkness, other creatures began to emerge. A rabbit, with fur like silver moonbeams, ventured from the undergrowth. A family of field mice appeared at the garden's edge. Even an old tomcat, scarred from many territorial disputes, padded silently into the circle of peace that seemed to radiate from Whisperwind's presence. She welcomed them all without words, understanding that beings of all kinds were drawn to spaces where they could simply exist without judgment or expectation. The stress that each creature carried, the rabbit's fear of predators, the mice's worry about winter stores, the cat's loneliness despite his fierce independence, all of it seemed to melt away in the gentle atmosphere of acceptance. Whisperwind began to weave moonbeams between her fingers, a skill that took decades to master and could only be practiced when the heart was completely still. The silvery light danced through her hands like liquid silk, forming patterns that spoke directly to the soul without needing to pass through the mind's busy interpretations. "Watch," she told her gathered audience, though she spoke more to the night itself than to any particular listener. "See how the moonlight doesn't struggle to be bright. It doesn't worry about whether it's bright enough or fear that tomorrow it might be dimmer. It simply shines with whatever light it has in this moment." The moonbeam tapestry she wove began to settle over the garden like a blanket of pure possibility. Under its gentle influence, the rabbit's breathing deepened. The mice curled together in a warm, trusting huddle. The old tomcat stretched out fully for the first time in months, his guard finally lowered. As the night deepened, Whisperwind began the ancient practice that gave her lineage its name. She gathered the worries and tensions that her visitors had unconsciously released, spinning them into silver threads. These threads, when woven together with intention and compassion, became something entirely new, a fabric of wisdom that could comfort future souls who carried similar burdens. The sparrow, now completely at peace, nestled into a small hollow in the garden wall. Its trust touched Whisperwind's heart, reminding her of her own journey from anxiety to acceptance. There had been a time when she too had carried the weight of uncontrollable tomorrows, when sleep had seemed as elusive as morning mist. She remembered the night when her teacher, an ancient woman whose name had been forgotten by everyone except the wind, had shown her this very technique. "Child," the old woman had said, "stress is not your enemy. It is simply energy that has lost its way home. Your job is not to fight it, but to help it remember the path to peace." That lesson had transformed Whisperwind's understanding completely. Instead of viewing her worries as invaders to be repelled, she began to see them as lost children who needed gentle guidance back to tranquility. This shift in perspective had changed everything, not just her own inner landscape, but her ability to help others find their way to rest. Now, as she continued weaving moonlight into healing patterns, Whisperwind reflected on how the same principle applied to sleep itself. So many beings, human and otherwise, struggled with rest because they approached it like a battle to be won, rather than a gift to be received. They would lie down with minds churning, trying to force their thoughts into submission, growing more wakeful with each failed attempt to sleep. But sleep, like peace, could not be conquered. It could only be invited, welcomed aloud. It required the same gentle acceptance that she offered to the creatures in her garden, a space of non-judgment, where natural rhythms could reassert themselves without interference from the anxious mind's endless commentary. The moonbeam tapestry was nearly complete, now shimmering with all the transformed energy that had been freely given by her visitors. Whisperwind knew that tomorrow each of these creatures would carry a piece of this peace back to their own territories, spreading calm like seeds on the wind. The sparrow stirred slightly in its hollow, and Whisperwind noticed that its breathing had synchronized with the gentle pulse of moonlight in her hands. This was the deepest magic of all, not the dramatic transformations told in stories, but the quiet miracle of one being's peace creating space for another's rest. As the final threads of moonlight settled into place, Whisperwind felt the familiar sensation that marked the completion of her evening work. The garden, already peaceful, seemed to exhale with satisfaction. The transformed energy of stress and worry had become something beautiful, a luminous web of possibility that would comfort many souls throughout the night. She looked around at her sleeping visitors, the rabbit, dreaming of meadows without dangers, the mice warm in their perfect trust, the old tomcat purring softly in his first peaceful sleep in seasons. Each one had found their way to rest, not through struggle, but through the simple act of releasing what they could not control. Whisperwind smiled, knowing that somewhere in the valley other beings were settling into sleep, unconsciously benefiting from the peace that radiated outward from the small garden, where stress was composted into wisdom and worries were woven into comfort. Tomorrow would bring new visitors, new anxieties seeking transformation, new opportunities to practice the ancient art of peaceful presence. But tonight her work was complete. The Moonweaver's garden had fulfilled its purpose once again, providing a sanctuary where the weary could remember how to rest. The Dreamkeeper's lighthouse beyond the valley, where Whisper Wind tended her garden of transformed worries across 7 gentle hills and 3 whispering streams, stood a lighthouse unlike any other. Its keeper was a man called Quiet Heart, storm gentler, whose peculiar gift was the ability to calm the turbulent seas of restless minds, while ordinary lighthouses guided ships through treacherous waters. This one guided troubled souls through the choppy waves of sleepless nights. Quiet Heart had inherited this responsibility from his aunt, a woman who spoke only in questions and collected the colors that dreams left behind. The lighthouse itself was built from stones of crystallized silence, each one harvested from moments when the world held its breath in perfect stillness. Its light did not shine outward across water, but inward, illuminating the hidden depths of consciousness, where peace waited patiently to be discovered. On this particular evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of letting go, Quiet Heart noticed an unusual disturbance in the ethereal currents that flowed around his lighthouse. Someone somewhere was fighting sleep with the desperation of a swimmer battling a riptide. The waves of their struggle sent ripples through the fabric of the night, creating turbulence that even the most peaceful souls could feel. He climbed the spiral staircase that wound through the heart of his lighthouse, each step bringing him closer to the source of the disturbance. The stairs themselves were peculiar things carved from compressed moments of transition, those liminal spaces between waking and sleeping where transformation became possible. With each step, Quiet Heart felt his own consciousness shift, adapting to the frequency of the troubled sleeper he was called to help. At the top of the lighthouse, surrounded by windows that looked not across landscapes, but across states of being, Quiet Heart began his nightly ritual. He lit the great lamp, not with oil or electricity, but with the concentrated essence of serenity that he had gathered throughout the day. The light that emanated was warm and golden with depths that seemed to contain entire universes of calm. The beam from his lighthouse reached across dimensions of experience, touching the awareness of a woman named Restless Rachel, who lay in her bed 3 cities away, staring at her ceiling with eyes that burned from exhaustion. She had been trying to sleep for hours, her mind churning through tomorrow's presentations, unfinished conversations, and the endless list of things that demanded her attention. Rachel felt the lighthouse beam as a subtle shift in her room's atmosphere, though she could not have named what had changed. The air seemed softer somehow, less pressing. The weight of her thoughts, which had been crushing down on her chest like heavy blankets, began to lift ever so slightly. Quiet Heart, sensing her struggle, began to work with the techniques that his lineage had perfected over generations. He understood that forced relaxation was a contradiction in terms, like commanding a butterfly to land on your hand or ordering a cat to show affection. Instead, he created space where natural relaxation could unfold at its own pace. He began by acknowledging Rachel's struggle without judgment, sending waves of compassionate understanding through the lighthouse beam. "Your mind is working so hard," he whispered to the night, knowing that some part of her consciousness would receive his words like a gentle embrace. It believes that if it stops thinking about these problems, something terrible will happen. What dedication, what loyalty to your responsibilities. This acknowledgement created the first crack in Rachel's armor of alertness. She had expected to be criticized for her inability to sleep either by others or by her own inner voice. Instead, she felt understood, even appreciated for the very thing that was keeping her awake. The paradox of being honored for her sleeplessness created space for something new to emerge. Quiet Heart continued his gentle work, using the lighthouse beam to weave stories of acceptance around Rachel's racing thoughts. He did not try to stop her mind from thinking. Such efforts only created more turbulence. Instead, he helped her begin to view her thoughts differently, transforming them from urgent demands into gentle companions. Notice, he breathed into the golden light, how each thought believes it is the most important thing that has ever existed. Like children, all calling for attention at once, each one certain that its need is the most urgent. What if you could love them all while understanding that none of them require your immediate action at this very moment? Rachel felt a subtle shift in her relationship to her mental chatter. Instead of being swept away by each thought as it arose, she found herself able to observe them with a kind of gentle curiosity. Her worry about tomorrow's presentation was still there, but it had somehow become less solid, less demanding of her complete attention. From his lighthouse, Quiet Heart could sense the change in Rachel's inner weather. The frantic energy that had been radiating from her consciousness was beginning to settle like sediment in a glass of muddy water that is finally allowed to stand still. He continued his work, sending waves of patient presence through the beam. The lighthouse itself seemed to pulse with ancient wisdom, its crystallized silence, stones resonating with the frequency of deep peace. Quiet Heart had learned that true healing came not from adding something new, but from removing the obstacles that blocked the natural flow of rest. Like a gardener who does not force flowers to bloom, but simply removes the weeds that choke them. His role was to help clear away the mental debris that prevented sleep from arriving naturally. He began to tell Rachel a story without words, transmitting images and feelings through the lighthouse beam. She saw herself as a tired traveler at the end of a long journey approaching an inn, where the innkeeper asked no questions, but simply offered a clean bed and a warm welcome. The metaphor settled into her consciousness like a key finding its lock. As the minutes passed, Rachel felt her body beginning to remember what her mind had forgotten, that rest was not something to be achieved, but something to be allowed. Her muscles, which had been tense with the effort of trying to sleep, began to soften. Her breathing, which had been shallow and controlled, deepened into the natural rhythm that her body preferred. Quiet Heart sensed these changes and adjusted his lighthouse beam, accordingly shifting from the golden light of gentle awakening to the deeper amber glow of approaching rest. He had learned that each soul required a different frequency of assistance, and part of his gift was the ability to modulate his offering to match each person's unique needs. The night around the lighthouse grew deeper, and other souls began to appear in Quiet Heart's awareness. A businessman whose success had become a prison of endless responsibility, an artist whose creativity had transformed into anxiety about never producing anything worthy, a mother whose love for her children had become worry that shadowed her every moment. Each person carried their own version of the same fundamental struggle, the inability to trust that rest was safe, that letting go would not result in catastrophe. Quiet Heart understood this fear intimately, having wrestled with it himself before inheriting the lighthouse and learning its secrets. He remembered his own nights of sleepless struggling when he had believed that vigilance was the only thing standing between him and disaster. It had taken years of training under his aunt's guidance to understand that true awareness could exist within rest, that consciousness could be both alert and peaceful simultaneously. Now he shared this understanding through the lighthouse beam, helping each troubled sleeper discover that they could trust their deeper wisdom to keep watch while their surface mind rested. Like a loving parent taking over the night shift, their unconscious mind was perfectly capable of maintaining awareness while allowing their active thoughts to settle into stillness. Rachel, still lying in her distant bed, felt this trust beginning to take root in her consciousness. The fears that had been driving her mental activity, fear of forgetting something important, fear of being unprepared, fear of losing control, began to seem less substantial, not because they disappeared, but because she found herself able to hold them more lightly. Quiet Heart smiled, as he felt her resistance dissolving. This was always the most beautiful moment in his work, when a soul finally remembered that they did not have to carry the weight of the world alone, that there were forces of care and wisdom operating beyond their personal effort and control. The lighthouse beam softened further, taking on the deep indigo quality of late-night peace, through the windows that looked across states of being. Quiet Heart could see the various troubled sleepers beginning to settle. Some were already drifting into the gentle currents of approaching dreams, while others were simply resting in the space between waking and sleeping, no longer fighting the transition. He began the closing ritual of his nightly work, gathering the transformed energy of all the worry and restlessness that had been released. Like Whisper Wind, with her garden, he understood that this energy was not waste to be discarded, but raw material to be transformed. The sleepless anxiety of one night could become the peaceful dreams of many nights to come. As the lighthouse light dimmed to its gentlest setting, Quietheart felt the satisfaction that came with work well done. Across the dimensions of consciousness, souls were settling into rest, no longer struggling against the natural tide of sleep, but allowing themselves to be carried gently into the realm of dreams and restoration. Rachel, her thoughts finally quiet, felt sleep approaching like a trusted friend who had been waiting patiently for her to stop running and accept the gift of rest. Her last conscious thought was a feeling of gratitude for the mysterious sense of peace that had somehow found her in her moment of greatest struggle. The lighthouse stood sentinel through the remainder of the night, its gentle beam continuing to offer comfort to any soul who might need guidance through the territory between waking and dreams. Tomorrow would bring new struggles, new souls in need of the gentle art of letting go. But tonight, Quietheart's work was complete. The Breath Collector's Observatory. High above the clouds where Quietheart's lighthouse beam could barely reach, perched on a mountain peak that existed somewhere between the physical world and the realm of pure possibility, stood an observatory unlike any other. Its caretaker was a being known as Soft Cloud Whisperer, whose extraordinary ability was to collect the spaces between breaths and weave them into moments of profound stillness. The observatory itself was constructed from crystallized exhales of sleeping infants, each wall holding the essence of perfect trust and surrender. Its great telescope did not peer into distant galaxies, but into the intimate universe of human breath, where the rhythm of life revealed its deepest secrets about the nature of peace and the art of letting go. Soft had discovered her calling during a thunderstorm that had raged for 7 days and 7 nights, when she noticed that even in the height of the tempest, there were tiny pockets of absolute calm, not the eye of the storm, but the infinitesimal pauses between one gust of wind and the next. These microseconds of stillness contained more peace than entire hours of forced tranquility. On this night, as Whisper Wind was weaving moonbeams in her garden below, and Quietheart was guiding restless souls through his lighthouse beacon, Soft began to detect a disturbance in the breathing patterns of the valley. Through her telescope, she could observe the respiratory rhythms of every living being within a 100-mile radius, and tonight she noticed something troubling. The collective breath of the region was becoming increasingly shallow and rapid. Humans were breathing high in their chests, holding their breath during moments of stress, or hyperventilating through waves of anxiety. Animals were panting with unnecessary urgency. Even the trees seemed to be restricting their exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide, as if the very air had become thick with collective tension. This concerned Soft deeply, for she understood that breath was the bridge between the conscious and unconscious mind, the physical and spiritual body, the individual and the universal. When breathing became disrupted, it created ripples of disturbance that affected not only the breather, but the entire web of interconnected life. She began her work by adjusting the great telescope, focusing its lens on a particularly troubled pattern of breathing that originated from a small apartment where a young man named Marcus lay staring at his ceiling. Marcus had been carrying the weight of his family's financial struggles for months, taking on extra jobs and sacrificing sleep to make ends meet. His breathing had become so shallow that he was barely receiving enough oxygen to think clearly, let alone rest peacefully. Through the telescope, Soft-Sight could see the golden threads of Marcus's breath, not the physical air moving in and out of his lungs, but the energetic essence of his life force. These threads were tangled and knotted, constricted by worry and bound tight by the belief that he had to hold everything together through sheer force of will. Soft-Sight began the delicate work of breath collection, using techniques passed down through generations of cloud whisperers. She started by gathering the spaces between Marcus's breaths, those tiny pauses that existed between inhale and exhale, between exhale and inhale. These spaces, often overlooked and undervalued, contained infinite potential for peace. As she collected these breath spaces, Soft-Sight began to expand them gently, like a musician extending a pause in a symphony to create moments of profound beauty. She did not try to control Marcus's breathing, directly understanding that forced breathing techniques often created more tension than they released. Instead, she worked with the natural gaps that already existed, honoring the rhythm his body had chosen, while creating more space for peace to emerge. Marcus felt the shift immediately, though he could not have explained what was happening. His chest, which had been tight with the effort of containing his anxiety, began to soften. The breath that had been trapped in his upper lungs started to sink deeper, reaching places that had been holding tension for so long he had forgotten they could relax. Through her telescope, Soft-Sight watched the golden threads of Marcus's breath begin to untangle. Each exhale carried away a small portion of the stress he had been carrying, while each inhale brought in fresh possibility. She guided this process with the gentlest touch, like a master gardener who knows exactly when to water and when to let the plant find its own rhythm. The observatory itself began to resonate with the frequency of Marcus's gradually deepening breath. The walls of crystallized infant exhales hummed with recognition, remembering their own journey from the anxious breathing of new parents to the perfect trust of sleeping babies. This resonance created a feedback loop of calm that strengthened with each breath cycle. As Marcus's breathing continued to deepen, Soft-Sight expanded her focus to include the other troubled breathers in the valley. She could see Maria, a single mother whose breath had become erratic with the constant vigilance of caring for 3 children alone. There was James, whose breath was held tight with the fear of making mistakes at his new job, and countless others, each carrying their own pattern of restricted breathing that reflected their unique struggles with stress and anxiety. Working with multiple breathing patterns simultaneously required a level of awareness that few possessed. Soft-Sight had trained for decades to develop the ability to hold space for many different rhythms without losing her own center. She moved through the observatory like a conductor leading an invisible orchestra, orchestrating a symphony of healing breath that began to shift the entire valley's respiratory rhythm. The work was subtle, but profound. Rather than imposing any particular breathing pattern, Soft-Sight simply created space for each person's natural breath to find its own optimal rhythm. She understood that the body's wisdom was far greater than any technique or system. It knew exactly how to breathe for healing, if only given the space and support to remember. As she worked, Soft-Sight reflected on the ancient teaching that had guided her practice for so many years. Breath was not something to be controlled, but something to be befriended. Most people, especially when stressed or trying to sleep, approached their breath like a wild horse that needed to be tamed. They would try to force it into submission, commanding it to slow down, speed up, or follow some prescribed pattern. But breath, like sleep itself, responded better to invitation than to command. When approached with curiosity rather than control, with acceptance rather than judgment, it would naturally find its way to the rhythm that best served the body's needs in each moment. Marcus, still lying in his distant apartment, began to experience this truth firsthand as he stopped trying to control his breathing and simply allowed it to be whatever it was. He felt a profound shift in his relationship to his anxiety. The worries were still there, but they no longer felt like they were choking him. He could breathe around them, through them, with them. Soft-Sai smiled as she watched the golden threads of his breath begin to flow with the natural rhythm of deep rest. This was always the most beautiful part of her work, the moment when a soul remembered that they did not have to earn their next breath, that the universe was perfectly willing to support their existence without any effort or anxiety on their part. The night deepened around the observatory, and the collective breathing of the valley began to shift into a more harmonious pattern. The shallow, anxious breathing that had been creating disturbance was gradually giving way to the deeper, more restful rhythm that supported true healing and regeneration. Through her telescope, Soft-Sai could see the ripple effects of this change spreading outward, like circles on a pond. As the humans in the valley began to breathe more peacefully, the animals also began to relax. The trees seemed to exhale with relief, releasing the tension they had been holding in response to the collective stress of their environment. She began the final phase of her nightly work, weaving the collected breath spaces into a tapestry of silence that would support the valley's inhabitants throughout the night. These spaces, between breaths, were precious beyond measure. They were the moments when the mind naturally quieted, when the body remembered its inherent wisdom, when the soul could rest in its own essential nature. As she worked, Soft-Sai sent gentle waves of gratitude to her colleagues in the valley below. She could sense whisper wind in her garden, transforming worries into wisdom and quiet. Heart in his lighthouse, guiding troubled minds to rest. Each of them worked with the same fundamental understanding, that peace could not be forced, only allowed, and that the deepest healing came from creating space for natural wisdom to emerge. The observatory, filled with the soft light of collected breath spaces, creating an atmosphere of such profound peace that even the most restless souls in the valley could feel its influence. Marcus found himself drifting towards sleep for the first time in weeks, his breathing now so natural and effortless that he was barely conscious of it. Maria's erratic breath began to settle into the rhythm of trust, remembering that she did not have to monitor everything with her conscious mind. James's held breath began to release, allowing him to exhale the fear that had been constraining his chest for months. One by one, the troubled breathers of the valley found their way to the natural rhythm that supported rest and healing. The collective respiratory pattern shifted from anxiety to acceptance, from resistance to surrender, from the shallow breathing of fear to the deep breathing of trust. As the night reached its deepest point, Soft-Sai felt the satisfaction that came with work aligned with natural law. She had not forced anyone to breathe differently, had not imposed any artificial pattern or technique. Instead, she had simply created space for each person's inner wisdom to remember how to breathe for peace. The observatory settled into its own rhythm of rest, the crystallized walls humming with the frequency of perfect breath. Tomorrow would bring new patterns of troubled breathing, new souls who had forgotten how to trust their own respiratory wisdom. But tonight, the valley breathed as one deep and peaceful and free. Soft-Sai gazed out through her telescope one final time, watching the golden threads of breath flowing through the valley like a river of liquid light. Each breath was a prayer, each exhale a release, each inhale a renewal. In this simple, essential rhythm, she could see the entire mystery of existence, the eternal dance between letting go and receiving, between effort and ease, between holding on and allowing flow. The breath collector's work was complete for another night, and the valley slept peacefully under the gentle guardianship of beings who understood that the greatest healing came from the simplest acts of allowing natural wisdom to emerge. The Memory Keeper's Library. In the heart of the valley, where the light from Quiet Heart's lighthouse intersected with the breath streams flowing down from Soft Sigh's observatory, there stood a library that existed in 7 dimensions simultaneously. Its librarian was a woman called Gentle Page, Forgetting. Wisely, whose unique gift was the ability to help souls release the memories that kept them trapped in cycles of sleepless anxiety. This library contained no ordinary books. Instead of words printed on paper, its volumes were composed of crystallized experiences, moments of joy, sorrow, triumph, and regret that visitors had voluntarily offered up for transformation. The shelves stretched infinitely upward and inward, holding every story that had ever prevented someone from finding peace in the present moment. Gentle Page had inherited this sacred responsibility from her predecessor, a man who had spent his entire lifetime learning how to forget skillfully, not the forgetting of denial or suppression, but the art of releasing memories from their prison of repetitive replay, allowing them to transform from sources of suffering into wells of wisdom. On this night, as the valley settled into the harmonious, breathing rhythm that Soft Sigh had orchestrated, Gentle Page noticed a particular disturbance in the memory streams that flowed through her library. Someone somewhere was replaying the same painful experience over and over, like a broken record that could not move beyond a single scratched refrain. She moved through the library with steps that made no sound, her feet finding the spaces between moments where movement became possible without disturbing the delicate equilibrium of stored experiences. The disturbance was coming from the section where regrets were kept, those crystallized moments when someone's mind insisted on replaying scenarios that could never be changed. Through her awareness, Gentle Page could sense the source of the disturbance. A woman named Catherine lay in her bed across town, her mind churning through a conversation she'd had with her daughter 3 days ago. The conversation had ended badly, with words spoken in anger that Catherine now wished she could take back. Her mind played the scene repeatedly each time, suggesting different things she could have said, different ways she could have responded. This mental replay was preventing Catherine from sleep. But more than that, it was preventing her from being present to the possibility of healing that existed in this moment. She was so trapped in the prison of her regret that she could not see the doorway to peace that was always available in the now. Gentle Page approached the shelf where Catherine's particular type of regret was stored, the section devoted to painful conversations with loved ones. These crystallized experiences glowed with a particular shade of amber light, warm, but tinged with the sadness of connection interrupted by misunderstanding. She selected a volume that resonated with Catherine's specific situation and began the delicate work of memory transformation. This was not about erasing or denying what had happened, but about changing the relationship to the memory so that it could become a source of wisdom rather than a cause of suffering. Opening the crystallized experience. Gentle Page began to weave threads of compassion through the painful moment. She helped Catherine's consciousness understand that the harsh words had come from a place of love, twisted by fear that both she and her daughter had been trying to protect something precious, but had used clumsy tools that created wounds instead of healing. Catherine, lying in her distant bed, felt a subtle shift in her internal landscape. The memory of the argument was still there, but something about it had changed. Instead of feeling like sharp edges cutting into her peace, it began to feel more like a sad song that acknowledged pain while pointing toward the possibility of reconciliation. Gentle Page continued her work using techniques that took decades to master. She understood that memories were living things, not static recordings. They changed each time they were accessed, influenced by the consciousness that was remembering. This meant that painful memories could be transformed not by changing what had happened, but by changing the awareness that was relating to what had happened. The library around her hummed with the frequency of healing memory work. Other crystallized experiences began to resonate with the transformation taking place, creating a cascade of healing that rippled through the interconnected web of stored moments. A businessman's regret about a failed project began to transform into gratitude for lessons learned. A mother's guilt about not being perfect began to shift into acceptance of her human limitations. As Gentle Page worked, she shared the wisdom that her lineage had discovered over generations of memory keeping. The past, she whispered to the crystallized experiences, is not a fixed thing that happened to you. It is a living story that you are constantly creating through the act of remembering. Each time you revisit a memory, you have the opportunity to relate to it differently, to find new meaning, to extract different lessons. Catherine felt this truth settling into her consciousness, like a key finding its lock. The argument with her daughter had happened, yes, but the meaning of that argument was not fixed. It could be the story of two people who loved each other badly in one moment, but it could also become the story of love, learning to express itself more skillfully through the gift of mutual forgiveness. The crystallized experience in Gentle Page's hands began to glow with a softer light as the transformation deepened. The harsh edges of regret were being worn smooth by the gentle action of compassionate understanding. The memory was not disappearing, but it was losing its power to create suffering. Through the library's windows that looked into the landscape of human consciousness, Gentle Page could see other souls struggling with similar burdens. There was David, whose mind replayed every mistake he had made in his business over the past 5 years. Sarah, who could not stop thinking about the relationship that had ended, analyzing every conversation for clues about what she could have done differently. Michael, who was tormented by memories of his father's criticism from decades ago. Each of these souls was trapped in the same fundamental misunderstanding, the belief that if they could just think about their painful memories enough, they could somehow change what had happened or prevent similar pain in the future. But Gentle Page understood that this kind of mental replay was like trying to heal a wound by constantly picking at the scab. She expanded her awareness to include all of these struggling souls working with multiple memory streams simultaneously. The library's infinite shelves provided access to every type of painful memory that humans carried: betrayals and disappointments, losses and failures, moments of shame, and episodes of fear. For each type of memory, Gentle Page had developed specific transformation techniques. Memories of loss needed to be touched with gratitude for what had been experienced. Memories of failure required the gentle understanding that all learning involved mistakes. Memories of betrayal needed to be washed with the recognition that hurt people often hurt people, and that understanding this did not excuse the behavior, but could free the rememberer from carrying the poison of resentment. As she worked, the library filled with a soft, healing light that seemed to emanate from the crystallized experiences themselves. This was always the most beautiful part of her work, the moment when painful memories transformed into sources of wisdom, when what had been a burden became a gift. Catherine felt her internal struggle beginning to dissolve. The urgent need to replay the argument with her daughter was fading, replaced by a gentle clarity about what she wanted to do differently in their next conversation. The memory had not disappeared, but it had transformed from a source of torment into a teacher of love. David's obsessive replay of business mistakes began to shift into appreciation for the experience he had gained. Sarah's analysis of her ended relationship transformed into gratitude for the love she had experienced and the self-knowledge she had gained. Michael's painful memories of criticism began to heal into understanding of his father's own wounds and limitations. One by one, the trapped souls began to experience the freedom that came with releasing their death grip on unchangeable past moments. They discovered that they could honor their experiences without being enslaved by them, that they could learn from their mistakes without replaying them endlessly. Gentle Paige smiled as she felt the collective shift in the valley's consciousness. The mental replay loops that had been creating so much suffering were beginning to dissolve, replaced by the peaceful awareness that existed when the mind was not trapped in cycles of regret and rumination. The library settled into its nighttime rhythm, the crystallized experiences glowing softly with the transformed energy of released suffering. The infinite shelves held countless stories, but now they were stories of wisdom rather than wounds, teachers rather than tormentors. As the deepest part of the night approached, Gentle Paige began the closing ritual of her work. She gathered the energy that had been released through the memory transformations and wove it into a blanket of forgiveness that settled over the valley like morning dew. This forgiveness was not just for others, but for the self, recognition that all beings were doing their best with the awareness and resources they had in each moment. Catherine drifted toward sleep for the first time in days, her mind finally free from the obsessive replay of regret. The argument with her daughter still existed in her memory, but it had transformed from a source of suffering into a reminder of how much she loved her child and how much she wanted to learn to love more skillfully. The other souls throughout the valley also began to find their way to rest, no longer held hostage by memories that had been transformed from prisons into doorways. They discovered that the present moment was always available as a refuge, that peace was not something that required fixing the past, but something that emerged when they stopped fighting with what had already happened. Gentle Paige moved through her library one final time, ensuring that all the crystallized experiences were properly cared for and that the transformation work was complete. Tomorrow would bring new memories in need of healing, new souls trapped in cycles of regret and rumination. But tonight, the past had been released into wisdom, and the present moment reclaimed as a place of peace. The Memory Keeper's library stood as a testament to the truth that nothing in life was wasted. Every experience, no matter how painful, contained the seeds of wisdom and growth. In the gentle hands of skilled awareness, even the most difficult memories could be transformed from sources of suffering into wellsprings of compassion and understanding. The valley rested peacefully under the care of beings who understood that healing was not about changing what had happened, but about changing the relationship to what had happened. In this shift of relationship, freedom was always possible, and peace was always just a moment of acceptance away. The Shadow Weaver's Cave. Deep beneath the valley where Whisper Wind tended her garden, and Gentle Paige transformed painful memories, there existed a cave system that most inhabitants never knew about. Its entrance was hidden behind a waterfall that sang lullabies in 7 ancient languages, accessible only to those who had learned to embrace rather than flee from their own darkness. The cave's guardian was a mysterious figure known as Darkheart Shadow Dancer, whose gift was the ability to help souls integrate the parts of themselves they had spent lifetimes trying to escape. While others worked with obvious sources of sleeplessness, like worry and regret, Darkheart specialized in the hidden disturbances, the rejected aspects of self that created restlessness from the shadows of consciousness. The cave itself was carved from stone that absorbed rather than reflected light, creating a space of such profound darkness that visitors were forced to navigate by feeling and intuition rather than sight. Paradoxically, this darkness was not frightening, but deeply comforting, like being held in the womb of infinite possibility, where all potentials existed before being shaped by the harsh light of judgment. On this night, as the other guardians worked their healing magic throughout the valley, Darkheart sensed a particular type of disturbance that only she could address. Someone was lying awake, tormented, not by obvious anxiety or painful memories, but by a deep sense of wrongness about themselves, the kind of self-rejection that created a low-grade fever of consciousness that prevented true rest. She moved through her cave with steps that made friends with silence, following underground streams that carried not water, but the liquid essence of accepted shadow. These streams flowed through chambers carved by centuries of tears shed in relief by souls who had finally learned to love their own darkness. The disturbance was emanating from a young artist named Thomas, who lay in his studio apartment, surrounded by paintings he considered failures. Thomas had spent years crafting a public persona of confidence and success, but privately, he was consumed by shame about what he perceived as his inadequacies. His need to appear perfect had created an internal war between his authentic self and his ideal self, leaving him exhausted but unable to rest. Through the cave's mystical connections to the deeper currents of consciousness, Darkheart could see Thomas's shadow, all the parts of himself he had deemed unacceptable and tried to hide. There was his vulnerability, which he perceived as weakness, his need for approval, which he judged as pathetic, his anger at the world's indifference to his art, which he condemned as ungrateful, his fear of failure, which he saw as cowardice. Each of these rejected aspects existed in the shadows of his consciousness, creating an underground rebellion that prevented peace. Like political prisoners staging a hunger strike, they refused to allow rest until they were acknowledged and integrated back into the wholeness of his being. Darkheart began the delicate work of shadow integration, using techniques that had been developed over millennia by beings who understood that wholeness could not be achieved through rejection, but only through radical acceptance. She started by creating a safe space in the cave where Thomas's disowned aspects could emerge without fear of judgment or banishment. Thomas, lying in his distant apartment, felt a subtle shift in his internal climate. The harsh voice of self-criticism that usually dominated his inner dialogue began to soften slightly. He found himself able to acknowledge, just barely, that perhaps his vulnerability was not a flaw, but evidence of his capacity to feel deeply. The cave resonated with this small movement toward self-acceptance, its light-absorbing walls humming with the frequency of integration. Darkheart understood that shadow work could not be rushed. Forced acceptance was just another form of rejection. Instead, she created conditions where natural wholeness could gradually emerge. She began to weave stories in the darkness, tales of heroes who discovered that their greatest weaknesses were actually their hidden strengths of artists, who found their authentic voice only after accepting their imperfections, of humans who learned that their darkness was not something to be eliminated, but integrated. These stories did not reach Thomas through his conscious mind, but settled into his deeper awareness, like seeds finding fertile soil. His need for approval, which he had always seen as a shameful weakness, began to reveal itself as evidence of his deep caring about connection and impact. His fear of failure started to show its other face. His passion for excellence and his courage in continuing to create despite uncertainty. The shadow integration process was subtle but profound. Rather than trying to change or eliminate the aspects of himself he disliked, Thomas began to understand them differently. His perfectionism was not just an obstacle to peace, but also the source of his dedication to craft. His sensitivity was not just a vulnerability, but also the wellspring of his artistic vision. Darkheart worked with the patience of stone and the persistence of water, understanding that true healing happened in its own time and could not be forced. She had learned from her predecessor, an ancient being who had spent eons learning to love the parts of existence that others found unacceptable, that shadow work was fundamentally about expanding the definition of what was worthy of love. As the night deepened, other souls began to appear in Darkheart's awareness, people throughout the valley who were struggling with their own forms of self-rejection. There was Jennifer, who could not sleep because she was ashamed of her neediness after her divorce. Mark, who lay awake, judging himself for his lack of career success. Linda, whose insomnia was fueled by guilt about her moments of irritation with her aging parents. Each person was trapped in a variation of the same fundamental split, the division between who they thought they should be and who they actually were. This division created an internal conflict that made peace impossible, like trying to rest while being pulled in opposite directions by competing parts of the self. Darkheart expanded her work to include all of these struggling souls, weaving threads of acceptance through the underground streams that connected all consciousness. The cave system itself began to pulse with the rhythm of integration, each chamber resonating with a different frequency of wholeness. In the chamber of accepted anger, she helped souls understand that their rage was often love that had been wounded. In the chamber of embraced fear, she showed them that their terror was frequently wisdom, wearing a frightening mask. In the chamber of integrated sadness, she revealed how their sorrow was evidence of their capacity for deep feeling and connection. Thomas felt these shifts as a gradual warming in his chest, as if parts of himself that had been frozen in isolation were slowly thawing in the gentle heat of acceptance. His shame about needing approval began to transform into appreciation for his desire to contribute meaningfully to the world. His fear of failure started to reveal itself as healthy respect for the risks involved in authentic, creative expression. The transformation was not dramatic, but profound, like ice melting so gradually that you only notice the change when you realize that what was once solid has become flowing water. Thomas found himself able to breathe more deeply as the internal war between his acceptable and unacceptable parts began to cease. Darkheart smiled in the darkness, recognizing the subtle signs that indicated successful shadow integration. The frantic energy that had been generated by self-rejection was transforming into the peaceful power that came from wholeness. When beings stopped fighting with themselves, they discovered reserves of energy they never knew existed. The cave system filled with a different quality of darkness now, not the absence of light, but the presence of infinite possibility. This was the darkness of the womb of deep sleep, of the fertile void from which all creation emerged. It was darkness as ally rather than enemy shadow, as teacher rather than tormentor. As the work continued, Thomas began to understand something that revolutionized his relationship with himself. His so-called negative qualities were not mistakes to be corrected, but essential aspects of his wholeness that had been misunderstood and mislabeled. His neediness was actually his capacity for connection. His anger was his ability to recognize injustice. His fear was his intelligence about genuine dangers. This realization created a cascade of integration throughout his consciousness. Parts of himself that had been at war for years began to recognize each other as allies with different but complementary gifts. The perfectionist and the rebel discovered they were both devoted to excellence, just with different strategies. The critic and the dreamer realized they were both committed to creating meaningful work. Jennifer, lying in her bed across town, felt her shame about post-divorce neediness beginning to transform into appreciation for her capacity to form deep bonds. Mark's self-judgment about career success started to shift into recognition of his values-based choices. Linda's guilt about irritation with her parents began to integrate into understanding of her legitimate need for boundaries and self-care. One by one, the souls throughout the valley began to experience the peace that came with internal integration. They discovered that they did not need to be perfect to be worthy of rest, that their flaws and shadows were not obstacles to peace, but integral parts of their wholeness that had been temporarily misunderstood. Darkheart felt the collective shift as a deepening of the darkness in her cave. Not darker in the sense of more troubling, but deeper in the sense of more complete, more whole, more able to hold all aspects of existence without judgment. This was the darkness of true rest, where all parts of the self could finally lay down their weapons and sleep in peace. The underground streams began to flow more freely, carrying the transformed energy of integrated shadow throughout the valley's consciousness. Above ground, the other guardians could sense this shift. Whisperwind felt her garden soil becoming richer with compost made from accepted imperfection. Quiet noticed his lighthouse beam becoming more penetrating as it reflected the completeness of integrated souls. As the deepest part of the night approached, Darkheart began the closing ritual of her work. She gathered the energy that had been released through shadow integration and wove it into a blanket of self-compassion that settled over the valley like a gentle fog. This compassion was not the soft kind that avoided difficult truths, but the fierce kind that loved fiercely enough to embrace even the most challenging aspects of existence. Thomas drifted towards sleep for the first time in weeks. His internal war finally ended through the revolutionary act of self-acceptance. He still had the same personality traits, the same vulnerabilities and fears, but they were no longer sources of shame. They had been integrated into his wholeness as essential aspects of his unique way of being human. The Shadow Weaver's cave settled into its own rhythm of deep rest, the light-absorbing walls humming with the frequency of wholeness. The streams of liquid shadow flowed peacefully through chambers where acceptance had transformed what was once rejected into what was now embraced. Tomorrow would bring new souls struggling with self-rejection, new opportunities to practice the radical art of loving what had been deemed unlovable. But tonight, the valley rested in the peace that came when all parts of the self were finally welcomed home. In the profound darkness of complete acceptance, where no aspect of existence was turned away, true rest became possible. The Shadow Weaver's work was complete, and the valley slept in the wholeness that embraced both light and dark as essential partners in the dance of conscious existence. The Time Tender's hourglass tower. At the precise center of the valley, where all the healing energies converged like rivers meeting the sea, stood a tower that existed in all moments simultaneously. Its keeper was an enigmatic being called Nowness, Moment Weaver, whose extraordinary gift was the ability to help souls escape from the prison of temporal anxiety, the endless worry about future events and past mistakes that kept them suspended between what was and what might be. The tower itself was constructed from crystallized present moments, each brick formed from instances when someone had been completely absorbed in the now. Its spiral staircase was made of compressed attention, and its walls hummed with the frequency of pure presence. At the tower's apex sat an hourglass, unlike any other. Instead of sand, it contained the flowing essence of time itself, each grain a perfect moment of awareness. Nowness had inherited this sacred duty from her teacher, a woman who had spent her entire life learning to live in the space between thoughts, in the eternal, now that existed before the mind could label it as past or future. The hourglass at the tower's peak was not merely decorative, but functional. It helped regulate the temporal flow of consciousness throughout the valley, ensuring that beings could find their way back to the present moment when anxiety about time pulled them away from peace. On this night, as the other guardians worked their healing throughout the valley, Nowness detected a particular disturbance in the temporal streams that flowed around her tower. Someone somewhere was caught in what she recognized as a time anxiety loop, their consciousness scattered across multiple temporal dimensions, trying to live in several time zones of worry simultaneously. She climbed the crystallized staircase with steps that honored each moment, feeling her awareness settle more deeply into the present with each level she ascended. The disturbance was coming from someone whose mind was fragmented across time, part of their attention trapped in regret about the past part, anxiously projecting into imagined futures with almost nothing remaining to experience the peace that was available right now. Through the tower's windows that looked not across space but across time, Nowness could see the source of the disturbance. A businessman named Robert lay in his hotel room, his mind spinning between yesterday's board meeting that hadn't gone as planned, tomorrow's presentation that might determine his career future, and next month's performance review that could result in his dismissal. Robert's consciousness was like a person trying to stand with one foot on a dock, one foot on a departing boat, and his hands reaching for a helicopter hovering overhead. The strain of existing in multiple time streams simultaneously was exhausting him, but he couldn't figure out how to gather his scattered attention back into the present moment where actual rest was possible. Nowness began her work by adjusting the great hourglass at the tower's peak, slowing the flow of temporal sand to create more space between moments. This didn't change the actual speed of time, but altered the perception of time's passage, creating breathing room in consciousness where awareness could settle without feeling rushed or pressured. Robert felt this shift as a subtle slowing of his mental chatter. The urgent sense that he needed to figure out everything right now began to soften slightly. The frantic quality of his thoughts, jumping from past to future and back again, started to settle into a more natural rhythm. The tower began to resonate with the frequency of pure present moment awareness, its crystallized walls humming with the energy of concentrated attention. Nowness understood that time anxiety was one of the most common causes of sleeplessness in the modern world. Minds trained to constantly project into hypothetical futures or replay problematic pasts had forgotten how to rest in the eternal now, where peace was always available. She began to weave threads of presence around Robert's scattered consciousness, gently gathering his attention back from its various temporal destinations. This was delicate work that required the touch of a master weaver. Too much force would create resistance, while too little would allow the mind to continue its frantic time traveling. Through her awareness, Nowness could sense Robert's specific pattern of temporal anxiety. His mind would start in the present moment, but within seconds, it would be pulled into worry about tomorrow's presentation. From there, it would leap to anxiety about the potential consequences if the presentation went badly. Then it would spiral into catastrophic thinking about losing his job, being unable to pay his mortgage, disappointing his family. This mental time travel was exhausting because it required Robert to experience potential suffering that existed only in imagination. He was living through dozens of possible futures simultaneously, most of which would never occur, while completely missing the present moment, where he was actually safe, lying in a comfortable bed, with no immediate threats to his well-being. Nowness began to demonstrate the art of temporal presence. By example, her own consciousness settling so completely into the current moment that it created a field of presence around the tower. This field acted like a gentle gravitational pull, inviting scattered awareness back to the here and now without forcing the return. Robert felt this invitation as a subtle shift in his relationship to his thoughts about the future. Instead of being dragged along by each worry as it arose, he found himself able to observe them with a kind of gentle detachment. The presentation was still happening tomorrow, but he began to realize that thinking about it right now wasn't actually preparing him. It was just preventing him from resting, so he would be refreshed for tomorrow's actual event. The hourglass at the tower's peak began to pulse with a rhythm that matched the natural cycles of attention, the way awareness naturally contracted and expanded, focused and relaxed, engaged and rested. Nowness had discovered that fighting against these natural rhythms created tension, while working with them created flow. As her work continued, other souls throughout the valley began to appear in her awareness, people whose sleep was disrupted by various forms of temporal anxiety. There was Sandra, whose mind raced with tomorrow's to-do list every night when she tried to rest. David, who couldn't stop replaying conversations from earlier in the day, analyzing what he should have said differently. Maria, whose insomnia was fueled by worry about her children's futures and whether she was making the right parenting decisions. Each person was experiencing a variation of the same fundamental displacement from the present moment. They were trying to solve problems that didn't exist, in the now preparing for challenges that were purely hypothetical, or attempting to change events that had already concluded. This temporal displacement made rest impossible because peace existed only in the present moment. It couldn't be found in the past, which no longer existed, or in the future, which was still only imagination. Nowness expanded her work to include all of these temporally anxious souls using the hourglass to create pockets of expanded present moment awareness throughout the valley. Each person experienced this shift differently, but the effect was the same, a gradual gathering of scattered attention back into the here and now where actual peace was available. The tower began to emit waves of temporal healing that rippled outward through the valley like circles on a pond. These waves didn't change what had happened or what might happen, but they created space for awareness to rest in what was actually happening right now. The simple, immediate experience of breathing, of lying in bed, of being alive in this moment. Robert felt his consciousness gradually collecting itself back from its various time-traveling expeditions. The worries about tomorrow's presentation were still present in his awareness, but they had lost their urgent quality. He began to understand the difference between appropriate planning, which could be done during appropriate times, and anxious projection, which served no useful purpose and prevented rest. The transformation was subtle but profound. Instead of living simultaneously in multiple time zones of worry, Robert found his awareness settling into the immediate sensory experience of the present moment. He could feel the softness of his pillow, the comfortable temperature of the room, the gentle rhythm of his breathing. These simple present moment experiences contained a quality of peace that no amount of future planning or past analysis could provide. Nowness smiled as she watched the temporal healing ripple through the valley. This was always the most beautiful part of her work, the moment when scattered consciousness remembered its natural state of presence, when beings rediscovered that they didn't need to carry the weight of all time on their shoulders simultaneously. The hourglass continued its gentle pulsing, creating a rhythm that supported natural rest. Sandra found her mind's to-do list, transforming from urgent demands into simple reminders that could wait until tomorrow. David's replay of past conversations shifted from obsessive analysis into acceptance of what had already been said. Maria's worry about her children's futures softened into trust in her love and their resilience. As the night deepened, the tower became a beacon of temporal peace, its crystallized walls glowing with the energy of concentrated presence. The temporal streams that flowed around the tower shifted from the choppy, anxious rhythm of scattered attention to the smooth, peaceful flow of gathered awareness. Nowness began the closing phase of her work, using the hourglass to create a valley-wide field of present moment awareness that would support peaceful sleep throughout the night. This field didn't eliminate thoughts about past or future, but created space where such thoughts could be held lightly without the urgent quality that prevented rest. The tower itself seemed to settle more deeply into the present moment, its crystallized walls humming with the frequency of temporal peace. Each brick of compressed attention glowed with the warm light of awareness that had found its way home to the here and now. Robert drifted toward sleep. His consciousness finally gathered in the present moment, where rest was naturally available. Tomorrow's presentation still existed as a future event, but it no longer had the power to rob him of tonight's peace. He had rediscovered the simple truth that the present moment was the only time and place where he actually existed, and therefore the only time and place where peace was possible. Throughout the valley, other souls were making similar discoveries. They found that when they stopped trying to live in multiple time zones simultaneously, enormous amounts of energy became available for rest and healing. The present moment, which they had been rushing past in their anxiety about other times, revealed itself to be a sanctuary where peace was always waiting. The Time Tender's tower stood as a testament to the truth that all of life happened in the present moment. Past existed only as memory occurring now. Future existed only as imagination happening now. And peace was always available to awareness that remembered how to be present to what was actually occurring. As the deepest part of the night settled over the valley, Nowness adjusted the hourglass one final time, creating a gentle temporal field that would support restful sleep until dawn. The crystallized present moments that formed the tower's walls pulsed with peaceful energy, sending waves of temporal healing throughout the community of souls who had learned to come home to the here and now. The temporal streams flowed peacefully around the tower, no longer choppy with anxiety about other times, but smooth with the deep calm that came when consciousness remembered its natural state of presence. In this state, sleep was not something to be achieved, but something to be allowed, not a destination to reach, but a natural consequence of being fully present to the rest that was already available in this moment. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to practice presence, new challenges to the art of living in the here and now. But tonight, the valley rested in the peace that was always available to awareness that remembered how to be present to the simple miracle of existing in this moment, this breath, this perfect now. The Energy Shepherd's Spiral Grove. On the eastern edge of the valley, where the first light of dawn would eventually touch the earth, there grew a grove of trees arranged in a perfect spiral that seemed to pulse with life force itself. The guardian of the sacred space was known as Flowing Calm, Energy Herder, whose unique gift was the ability to guide the chaotic currents of emotional and physical energy that prevented souls from finding the stillness necessary for deep rest. Unlike the other guardians who worked with thoughts, memories, or time, Flowing Calm specialized in the invisible rivers of energy that flowed through all living beings. These currents, sometimes called chi prana or life force, could become turbulent during times of stress, creating internal storms that made peaceful sleep impossible, even when the mind was quiet. The spiral grove itself was a living mandala, each tree planted at precise points that created a natural vortex for energy healing. The trees were ancient willows, whose branches wove together overhead, forming a canopy that filtered and purified the energetic atmosphere. Their roots extended deep into the earth, drawing up the stable grounding energy that anxious souls desperately needed. On this night, as the valley settled into the harmony created by the other guardians' work, Flowing Calm sensed a particular disturbance in the energetic field that surrounded the community. Someone's energy was running in jagged, chaotic patterns, like electricity trying to flow through damaged circuits, creating sparks and short circuits that prevented the natural rhythm of rest and restoration. She moved through her grove with steps that followed the spiral pattern, each footfall helping to strengthen the vortex of healing energy that the trees created. The disturbance was emanating from a nurse named Elena, who had just finished a double shift at the hospital. Elena's energy field was completely dysregulated from hours of absorbing the pain and fear of her patients combined with the adrenaline rush of making life and death decisions under pressure. Elena lay in her apartment, her body exhausted, but her nervous system still buzzing with the intensity of her workday. She had tried everything she could think of to calm down: hot bath, herbal tea, meditation music, but the energy coursing through her system was too activated to settle into the gentle rhythm that sleep required. Through the grove's mystical connections to the valley's energy field, Flowing Calm could see Elena's energetic state clearly. Her chakras were spinning too rapidly, her meridians were congested with absorbed stress, and her aura was jagged with the electromagnetic static she had picked up from the hospital's intense environment. Most problematically, her energy was flowing upward and outward when it needed to flow downward and inward for rest. Flowing Calm began the delicate work of energy shepherding, using techniques that had been passed down through generations of healers who understood that peace was not just a mental state, but an energetic one. She started by creating a gentle current in the grove's energy field, like opening a valve to allow excess pressure to flow out safely. Elena felt this shift as a subtle release of tension in her solar plexus, though she couldn't have explained what was happening. The tight buzzing sensation that had been trapped in her chest since her shift started to soften and spread, becoming less concentrated and more diffuse. The spiral grove began to pulse with the rhythm of healthy energy flow, each tree contributing its own frequency to the healing symphony. Flowing Calm understood that chaotic energy needed patient guidance rather than forceful redirection, like a river in flood that must be allowed to find its natural channel rather than being dammed or diverted. She began to weave patterns of movement through the grove, her body becoming a conductor for the healing currents that the trees generated. These movements were not random, but followed precise patterns that had been developed over centuries, gestures that helped reorganize scattered energy into coherent flow postures that opened blocked meridians, breathwork that synchronized the various energy systems of the body. As she moved, Flowing Calm could sense other souls throughout the valley whose energy was similarly dysregulated. There was Marcus, the construction worker, whose physical labor had created knots of tension in his muscular system that prevented his energy from flowing smoothly. Sarah, the teacher, whose empathic nature had caused her to absorb the emotional chaos of her students. James, the accountant, whose sedentary lifestyle had created stagnation in his energy field that manifested as restless agitation when he tried to sleep. Each person's energetic disturbance had a different signature, but they all shared the common pattern of energy that was either too activated, too stagnant, or flowing in directions that didn't support rest and restoration. Flowing Calm expanded her work to include all of these souls, using the grove's energy vortex to create healing currents that could reach across the valley. The work required exquisite sensitivity to the subtle flows of life force that most people never noticed. Flowing calm had trained for decades to develop the ability to sense these invisible currents, learning to read the energetic landscape like a weather forecaster reads atmospheric patterns. She could feel where energy was stuck, where it was moving too rapidly, where it was flowing in directions that created imbalance rather than harmony. Elena began to experience the benefits of this energetic rebalancing as a gradual settling of her entire system. The buzzing intensity that had been keeping her wired began to transform into a different quality of aliveness, still vibrant, but no longer chaotic, like a wild river that had found its proper channel and could flow with both power and peace. The spiral grove itself began to glow with a soft pulsing light that was visible only to those with energetic sight. This was the light of life force, flowing in its natural patterns, creating the foundation for all healing and restoration. Flowing calm moved through this light like a dancer in a cosmic ballet, her movements helping to weave the scattered energy of the valley back into coherent flow. As her work continued, Elena felt her nervous system beginning to downregulate for the first time since her shift had begun 16 hours ago. The fight-or-flight activation that had been necessary for handling medical emergencies was finally beginning to give way to the rest and digest state that her body needed for healing and restoration. The shift was not just psychological, but physiological. Her heart rate began to slow, her breathing deepened, her muscles released their protective tension. Most importantly, her energy began to flow in the downward and inward direction that supported sleep rather than the upward and outward direction that maintained alertness. Flowing calm could see these changes rippling through Elena's energy field, like gentle waves on a pond. The jagged electric quality of her aura was smoothing into the soft, undulating patterns that indicated readiness for rest. Her chakras were slowing their frantic spinning and beginning to pulse in the steady rhythm that supported deep sleep and cellular regeneration. The grove responded to these changes by deepening its own healing frequency, the trees swaying gently in patterns that amplified the beneficial currents flowing through the valley. Other souls began to experience similar energetic shifts. Marcus felt the knots in his muscular system beginning to release. Sarah sensed the absorbed emotions of her students finally dissipating from her field. James noticed the stagnant energy in his body beginning to move and flow. Energy shepherding was perhaps the most subtle of all the healing arts practiced in the valley, working with forces that were completely invisible to ordinary perception, but absolutely fundamental to well-being. Flowing calm understood that all the mental techniques in the world could not create true peace if the underlying energy was dysregulated, just as all the energy work in the world could not help if the mind was trapped in patterns of stress and anxiety. This was why the guardians worked in harmony, each addressing a different aspect of the complex ecosystem that supported peaceful rest. Whisperwind transformed worry into wisdom. Quiet heart guided restless minds to stillness. Soft sigh regulated breathing patterns. Gentle page healed painful memories. Dark heart integrated rejected shadows. Nowness gathered scattered attention into presence, and flowing calm restored the healthy flow of life force that made all other healing possible. As the night reached its deepest point, flowing calm began the closing phase of her work, using the grove's energy vortex to create a stable field of balanced life force that would support the valley throughout the remaining hours of darkness. This field was like a gentle electrical current that helped synchronize all the biological rhythms that had been disrupted by stress and overactivation. Elena felt this synchronization as a profound settling that seemed to occur at the cellular level. Her body finally remembered how to be at rest rather than on alert, how to heal rather than defend, how to restore rather than expend. The energy that had been scattered throughout her system gathered into the steady, rhythmic pulse that supported deep, restorative sleep. The spiral grove settled into its own rhythm of nighttime energy flow, the trees breathing in harmony with each other and with the sleeping valley below. The energy currents that flowed through their root systems and branches created a network of healing that connected every living being in the community, ensuring that no soul need struggle alone with energetic imbalance. Marcus drifted into sleep as the tension knots in his muscles finally released their grip on his life force, allowing healing energy to flow freely through his tired body. Sarah felt the last of her students' emotional residue dissolve from her field, leaving her own authentic energy free to settle into rest. James experienced his stagnant energy beginning to circulate in healthy patterns that would continue working throughout the night to restore his vitality. Throughout the valley, beings discovered that peace was not just a mental state, but an energetic one, a condition of balanced life force, flowing in natural patterns that supported both alertness when needed and rest when appropriate. They learned that they were not separate from the great web of energy that connected all life, but part of an intricate system that could support their well-being when they remembered how to work with rather than against its natural flow. Flowing Calm completed her nightly work with a final movement through the grove, her steps following the spiral pattern that helped maintain the energy vortex. The trees whispered their gratitude in the ancient language of rustling leaves, acknowledging the completion of another night's healing work. The Energy Shepherd's Spiral Grove stood as a testament to the truth that healing happened at every level of existence: mental, emotional, spiritual, and energetic. When all these levels were addressed with wisdom and compassion, the natural state of peace could emerge, allowing souls to rest in the deep tranquility that was their birthright. As dawn approached, the grove maintained its gentle energy field, ensuring that the valley's inhabitants would wake refreshed and restored their life force, flowing in the healthy patterns that supported both peaceful sleep and vibrant wakefulness. The invisible rivers of energy that connected all beings pulsed with the rhythm of collective well-being, creating a foundation of vitality that would support whatever challenges and opportunities the new day might bring. Tomorrow would bring new energetic disturbances, new souls whose life force had been scattered by the intensity of modern existence. But tonight, the valley rested in the perfect balance that allowed healing to occur at the deepest levels of being. The Energy Shepherd's work was complete, and the Spiral Grove hummed with the frequency of life force, flowing in its most natural and beneficial patterns. The Connection. Weaver's Bridge of Hearts. Spanning the widest part of the valley where the river ran deepest, and the mists rose thickest, there stretched a bridge unlike any other. It was woven not from stone or steel, but from threads of connection itself, the invisible bonds that linked heart to heart, soul to soul, being to being. Its keeper was a compassionate presence known as Heartbridge Connection Weaver, whose sacred gift was the ability to heal the isolation that kept so many souls awake in the darkness of their own perceived unworthiness. The bridge itself seemed to shimmer between the visible and invisible worlds, its structure becoming more solid when approached by those who carried the weight of loneliness, more ethereal when crossed by those who already knew their place in the web of belonging. Its railings were carved from crystallized moments of recognition, those precious instances when beings suddenly realized they were not alone, had never been alone, could never truly be alone. Heartbridge had inherited this calling from her grandmother, a woman who had spent her lifetime collecting the threads of connection that others had dropped or forgotten. The old woman had taught her that loneliness was not about being physically alone, but about forgetting one's fundamental interconnectedness with all life. This forgetting created a wound in the soul that ached especially at night, when the distractions of day could no longer mask the deep hunger for belonging. On this night, as the other guardians worked their healing magic throughout the valley, Heartbridge sensed a particular pattern of disturbance that only she could address. It was the signature of souls lying awake in beds that felt too large in rooms, that felt too empty in lives that felt too isolated from the warmth of genuine connection. She walked to the center of her bridge with steps that honored the sacred act of crossing from separation to unity, feeling the structure respond to her presence by glowing softly with the warm light of unconditional belonging. From this vantage point, she could sense the lonely hearts scattered throughout the valley, each one convinced that they were the only person awake, the only one struggling, the only one who felt fundamentally disconnected from the stream of life. The strongest signal of isolation was coming from an elderly man named William, who lived alone in a small cottage on the valley's outskirts. William had been widowed for 3 years, and despite the kindness of neighbors and the concern of his adult children, he felt profoundly alone in the world. His sleeplessness wasn't caused by worry or regret, but by the deep ache of missing his life companion, and the growing fear that he no longer had a meaningful place in the world. Through the bridge's mystical connections to the heartstreams that flowed between all beings, Heartbridge could see William's isolation clearly. The threads of connection that had once bound him to his beloved wife, to his community, to his sense of purpose appeared frayed and broken. He lay in his bed, feeling like a satellite that had drifted out of orbit, no longer held in place by the gravitational pull of belonging. Heartbridge began her work by weaving new threads of connection, starting with the most fundamental truth of all, that William's existence mattered to the universe itself. She understood that loneliness was often based on the false belief that love had to be earned, that belonging was conditional, that connection required the approval of others. Her gift was helping souls remember that they were worthy of love simply by virtue of existing. William felt this work begin as a subtle warmth in his chest, as if someone had lit a small candle in a room that had been dark for too long. The crushing weight of insignificance that had been pressing down on him began to lift ever so slightly, replaced by something he couldn't quite name, but recognized as the opposite of despair. The bridge began to pulse with the rhythm of universal connection, its crystallized moments of recognition glowing more brightly as Heartbridge worked. She could see the invisible threads that connected William to every person whose life he had touched: his children, grandchildren, former colleagues, students he had taught decades ago, strangers he had helped with small kindnesses that he had forgotten but they remembered. These connections had never actually been broken. Heartbridge realized they had simply become obscured by William's grief and his belief that love ended with physical separation. Her task was not to create new connections, but to help him see the ones that had always been there, flowing like invisible rivers of care and impact beneath the surface of his awareness. She began to illuminate these hidden connections, sending gentle pulses of recognition along the threads that bound William's heart to others. He felt this as a gradual remembering, moments when his daughter called just to hear his voice, times when his neighbor smiled with genuine warmth, instances when a cashier's day seemed brighter after his friendly greeting. As William's awareness of his existing connections began to strengthen, Heartbridge expanded her work to include other souls throughout the valley who were struggling with isolation. There was Jennifer, recently divorced and convinced that she was unlovable; Marcus, whose social anxiety had convinced him that others found him boring and worthless; Elena, whose demanding career had left her feeling professionally successful but personally disconnected from meaningful relationships. Each person carried their own version of the fundamental wound, the forgetting of their inherent worthiness of love and belonging. Some had experienced rejection that seemed to confirm their worst fears about themselves. Others had grown up in families where love was conditional on performance. Still others had simply absorbed cultural messages that suggested their value depended on external achievements rather than their essential humanity. Heartbridge understood that healing isolation required more than just reminding people of their existing connections. It required helping them remember their intrinsic worthiness of love. The bridge itself was designed to facilitate this remembering, its structure serving as a metaphor for the truth that every being was part of an interconnected web of existence that could never truly reject or abandon them. As she worked weaving threads of connection and recognition throughout the valley, Heartbridge reflected on the teaching that had guided her practice for decades. Loneliness, she had learned, was not cured by having more people around, but by remembering one's fundamental belonging to the whole of existence. A person could feel lonely in a crowded room or completely connected while physically alone, depending on their awareness of their place in the web of being. William began to experience this truth as his perspective gradually shifted. The empty bed beside him, which had been a constant reminder of loss, began to feel less like evidence of abandonment and more like sacred space that held the eternal love he and his wife had shared. His solitude transformed from loneliness into a different kind of connection, a quiet communion with memories with nature visible through his window, with the broader community of souls who were also navigating the mystery of existence. The bridge pulsed with increasing warmth as more hearts throughout the valley began to remember their connections. Jennifer started to sense that her worth was not dependent on being in a relationship, but was inherent to her being. Marcus felt the first stirrings of understanding that his social anxiety was not evidence of his defectiveness, but of his sensitivity and desire for authentic connection. Elena recognized that her isolation was not permanent, but the result of choices she could change when she was ready. Heartbridge smiled as she felt the collective shift in the valley's emotional atmosphere. The sharp edges of loneliness were beginning to soften into something more like solitude, a state of aloneness that did not carry the pain of disconnection because it remained aware of fundamental belonging. The bridge itself began to shine more brightly, its crystallized moments of recognition creating a beacon of belonging that could be felt by sensitive souls far beyond the valley's borders. This was always the most beautiful part of Heartbridge's work, the moment when isolated hearts remembered their place in the great web of connection that had never actually been broken. As the night deepened, she began the more complex work of healing the deeper wounds that created chronic loneliness. These were the injuries to the trust centers of the heart, experiences of betrayal, abandonment, or rejection that had taught people to protect themselves by withdrawing from the vulnerability that genuine connection required. William carried this type of wound, she realized. Beneath his grief for his wife lay a deeper fear that opening his heart to new connections would only lead to more loss. His loneliness was partially a protective strategy, a way of avoiding the risk of caring deeply about people who might leave or die. Heartbridge approached these deeper wounds with the gentleness of a master healer, understanding that trust could not be forced, but only invited. She began to weave threads of safety around William's heart, helping him understand that love did not make loss more painful, but made life more meaningful. The capacity to love deeply was not a vulnerability to be protected against, but a gift to be treasured even when it came with the inevitable sorrow of impermanence. This healing work rippled through the valley's heart field, touching other souls who had closed their hearts against the risk of connection. They began to sense that isolation was not actually safer than vulnerability, It was just a different kind of suffering, one that deprived them of both the joy and the growth that came through caring deeply about others. The bridge began to emit a different quality of light now, not just the warm glow of recognition, but the deeper radiance of courage, the willingness to keep the heart open, despite the risks that openness entailed. This courage was contagious, inspiring souls throughout the valley to take small steps toward the connections they had been avoiding. As her work continued, Heartbridge wove connections not just between human hearts, but between all the valley's inhabitants and the broader web of existence. She helped them remember their connection to the trees that provided oxygen, the rain that nourished life, the earth that supported their bodies, the stars that put their daily concerns into cosmic perspective. This expansion of awareness created a profound shift in the experience of aloneness. When beings remembered their connection to the entire web of life, physical solitude no longer felt like isolation, but like a form of meditation, a quiet communion with the vast intelligence that permeated all existence. William felt this expansion as a gradual opening of his awareness beyond the boundaries of his personal grief. He began to sense his connection to the night itself, to the other sleepless souls scattered throughout the valley, to the very mystery of consciousness that allowed him to experience love, loss, and longing. His individual story of widowhood became part of the larger human story of learning to love in the face of impermanence. The bridge reached its full luminosity as the healing work neared completion, its crystallized moments of recognition creating a network of light that connected every heart in the valley. This network made visible what had always been true, that no being was ever truly alone, that every heart was held in the vast web of connection that was existence itself. As the deepest part of the night approached, Heartbridge began the final phase of her work, anchoring the connections she had woven so they would remain strong throughout the sleeping hours. The bridge itself became a permanent beacon of belonging, its light available to any soul who needed reminding of their place in the web of connection. William drifted toward sleep for the first time in months, without the crushing weight of loneliness on his chest. His bed still felt empty, but it no longer felt abandoned. He carried with him the awareness that love was not diminished by loss, but transformed by it, that his connection to his wife continued in ways that transcended physical presence. Throughout the valley, other hearts settled into rest, with renewed awareness of their belonging. Jennifer fell asleep, knowing that her worth was not determined by relationship status, but by her essential humanity. Marcus rested in the understanding that his sensitivity was a gift that would eventually help him form deeper connections. Elena drifted off, with plans to make small changes that would bring more authentic relationship into her life. The connection. Weaver's Bridge of Hearts stood luminous in the darkness, a testament to the truth that no being was ever truly alone in the universe. Its crystallized moments of recognition continued to pulse with the rhythm of universal belonging, sending waves of connection and comfort to any soul who needed reminding of their place in the great web of existence. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities for connection, new chances to practice the courage that genuine relationships required. But tonight, the valley rested in the peace that came from remembering that love was not scarce, but abundant, not earned, but inherent, not lost, but transformed. The bridgekeeper's work was complete, and hearts throughout the valley slept wrapped in the invisible threads of connection that had always bound them to the whole of existence. The Imperfection, Master's Wild Workshop. At the northwestern edge of the valley, where cultivated gardens gave way to untamed wilderness, stood a workshop that challenged every notion of order and control. Its proprietor was a wonderfully eccentric soul known as Messy Beauty Chaos Acceptor, whose extraordinary gift was helping perfectionists and control seekers discover the profound peace that came from embracing life's inherent messiness. The workshop itself was a magnificent contradiction. Tools scattered in seemingly random patterns that somehow made perfect sense when you needed to find something half-finished projects that had evolved into beautiful accidents, shelves organized by a logic that felt more like poetry than practicality. Every surface told the story of creative processes that had been allowed to unfold naturally, rather than forced into predetermined shapes. Messy Beauty had inherited this calling after spending years as a perfectionist herself, staying awake night after night, trying to control outcomes that were ultimately beyond her influence. Her transformation had come through learning to dance with uncertainty, rather than fight it, to find beauty in the unfinished, rather than demand completion, to trust the intelligence of natural processes rather than impose artificial order. On this night, as the valley settled into the harmony created by the other guardian's work, Messy Beauty sensed a familiar pattern of disturbance, the rigid tension that arose when souls tried to force life into neat, controllable packages. This tension was particularly strong tonight, radiating from multiple sources throughout the valley, where people lay awake because things weren't right enough for them to rest. She moved through her workshop with steps that followed no predetermined path, trusting her feet to find their way between projects and around corners in the organic way that life itself navigated obstacles. The strongest signal of controlling anxiety was coming from a marketing executive named Patricia, who lay in her apartment unable to sleep because her presentation for tomorrow was only 95% perfect instead of the 100% she demanded from herself. Through the workshop's mystical connections to the perfectionist streams of consciousness, Messy Beauty could see Patricia's internal state clearly. Her mind was like a museum where every piece had to be positioned exactly right before visitors could be allowed in. She was mentally rearranging slides, rewording phrases, and second-guessing decisions that had already been finalized, convinced that rest was only permissible once everything was absolutely flawless. Patricia's perfectionism wasn't just about the presentation. It was a way of trying to control life itself, to create an illusion of safety through flawless execution. She believed unconsciously that if she could just get everything perfect enough, she could prevent criticism failure and the chaotic unpredictability that made life feel dangerous. Messy Beauty began her work by creating a small disturbance in her workshop, deliberately rearranging a stack of papers so they weren't perfectly aligned, leaving a paintbrush in the middle of a clean workspace, allowing a half-finished sculpture to remain beautifully incomplete. These small acts of intentional imperfection sent ripples through the perfectionist's field of consciousness, introducing the radical idea that order and chaos weren't enemies, but dance partners. Patricia felt this influence as a subtle relaxation of the rigid standards she had been applying to her presentation. A tiny voice in her head whispered that maybe 95% was actually quite good, that the remaining 5% might even improve through organic discovery during the actual presentation rather than forced completion in advance. The workshop began to hum with the frequency of creative chaos, the energy that arose when perfectionist control was released and natural intelligence was allowed to emerge. Messy Beauty understood that perfectionism was often fear wearing the mask of excellence, a desperate attempt to create certainty in an inherently uncertain world. She began to weave demonstrations of beautiful imperfection throughout her workshop, each one designed to show Patricia and other struggling perfectionists that flaws could be features, that mistakes could be doorways to discovery, that the attempt to control outcomes often prevented the very excellence they were seeking. A ceramic bowl with an irregular rim became more beautiful because of its asymmetry. A painting where the artist had accidentally dripped paint in the wrong place discovered its perfect composition through that mistake. A piece of music that deviated from its original plan found its most moving passage in the improvised section. As these examples resonated through the perfectionist consciousness field, Patricia began to experience a revolutionary shift in perspective. Her presentation didn't need to be perfect to be effective. It needed to be authentic, engaging, and useful. The obsessive polishing she had been doing was actually making it less spontaneous and natural, more scripted and rigid. Messy Beauty could sense similar struggles throughout the valley. There was David, an accountant, who couldn't sleep because he had discovered a minor discrepancy in his records that would take days to track down, but had no actual impact on anything important. Sarah, a mother who lay awake mentally reorganizing her children's schedules to achieve an impossible balance between all their activities. Michael, an artist who had destroyed more paintings than he had finished because they didn't match his internal vision of perfection. Each of these souls was trapped by the exhausting belief that they had to get life right before they could rest. They were trying to control variables that were inherently uncontrollable to perfect processes that were designed to be evolutionary, to finish journeys that were meant to be ongoing. Messy Beauty expanded her work to include all of these struggling perfectionists, using her workshop as a broadcasting station for the radical acceptance of life's beautiful messiness. She began to demonstrate the art of good enough, not settling for mediocrity, but recognizing when additional effort would create diminishing returns and actually interfere with natural flow. The workshop filled with examples of this principle in action. A garden where some plants grew exactly as planned, while others found their own perfect places through happy accidents. A bookshelf organized not by any system, but by the organic relationships between ideas that wanted to live near each other. A work of art that was never finished, but continued evolving with each viewing. Patricia felt her internal museum beginning to relax its rigid rules. Maybe visitors could enjoy the collection even if every piece wasn't positioned with mathematical precision. Maybe the presentation would actually be more engaging if it retained some spontaneity, some room for organic development during delivery. This realization created a cascade of release throughout her system. The tension in her shoulders began to dissolve as she stopped trying to carry the weight of impossible standards. Her breathing deepened as she released the hypervigilance that perfectionism demanded. Her mind began to quiet as it stopped its frantic scanning for flaws and problems to fix. Messy Beauty smiled as she felt the collective shift in the valley's perfectionist field. This was always the most liberating part of her work, the moment when control seekers discovered that letting go of their death grip on outcomes actually improved the outcomes themselves. The workshop began to pulse, with a different energy now, not the chaotic energy of destruction, but the creative energy of organic unfolding. This was the energy that allowed seeds to become flowers without micromanaging every stage of growth, that allowed rivers to find the sea without forcing every turn and curve. As her work continued, Messy Beauty helped the perfectionists throughout the valley discover the difference between excellence and perfectionism. Excellence was about doing your best with the resources available and then releasing attachment to outcomes. Perfectionism was about trying to control results through impossible standards that actually prevented excellent work from emerging naturally. David began to understand that the minor discrepancy in his accounts was not a moral failing, but simply part of the inherent uncertainty that existed in all human systems. The important thing was not perfection, but consistency and integrity in his approach to his work. Sarah felt her rigid scheduling begin to soften into something more organic that accounted for the reality that children were not machines, but growing beings whose needs and interests naturally evolved. She discovered that flexibility was not lack of planning, but planning that was wise enough to expect the unexpected. Michael realized that his destroyed paintings had not been failures, but experiments that had taught him essential lessons about his craft. The fear of imperfection had been preventing him from taking the creative risks that would actually lead to breakthrough work. The workshop itself seemed to celebrate these revelations by becoming even more beautifully chaotic, projects rearranging themselves into new configurations, tools, finding homes in unexpected places, creative accidents, multiplying and revealing new possibilities that could never have been planned. Messy Beauty began the closing phase of her work by creating what she called a good enough blessing, a field of energy that reminded perfectionists throughout the valley that their worth was not dependent on flawless performance, but on their willingness to show up authentically and do their best with whatever resources they had. This blessing carried the revolutionary message that good enough was actually perfect for most situations, that done was often better than perfect, that the attempt to control outcomes frequently prevented the very results that natural intelligence would create if allowed to operate freely. Patricia felt this blessing settle into her consciousness, like a warm blanket finally giving her permission to rest, without having achieved the impossible standard of perfection she had been demanding from herself. Her presentation was ready enough, she was prepared enough, and tomorrow would unfold in whatever way was meant to happen, regardless of her late-night obsessing. The workshop settled into its own rhythm of beautiful chaos, every scattered tool, an unfinished project, a testament to the truth that life was a work in progress, rather than a problem to be solved. The organic disorder that some might mistake for messiness was actually a higher order, the order of natural intelligence, expressing itself through forms that couldn't be controlled but could be trusted. David drifted into sleep, knowing that his accounting work was solid and reliable, even if it wasn't mathematically perfect. Sarah rested in the understanding that her love for her children was more important than any scheduling system. Michael fell asleep with excitement about the paintings he would create when he stopped destroying them for not matching impossible standards. Throughout the valley, perfectionists and control seekers discovered the profound peace that came from releasing their death grip on outcomes and trusting the intelligence that operated through uncertainty, imperfection, and organic unfolding. They learned that excellence emerged naturally when the pressure for perfection was removed, that creativity flourished when control was relaxed, that life worked better when they worked with its inherent messiness rather than against it. The imperfection. Master's Wild Workshop stood as a monument to the beauty of the unfinished, the wisdom of good enough, and the perfection that existed within imperfection itself. Its creative chaos continued to broadcast the message that rest was not a reward for achieving perfection, but a necessity for maintaining the energy and perspective that allowed excellent work to emerge naturally. As the night deepened toward dawn, Messy Beauty made one final circuit through her workshop, appreciating the beautiful disorder that had emerged through a night of creative work. Tomorrow would bring new perfectionists, struggling with impossible standards, new control seekers, exhausted by their attempts to manage unmanageable variables. But tonight, the valley rested in the peace that came from accepting life's inherent messiness as a feature rather than a bug. The workshop hummed with the frequency of creative acceptance, its scattered beauty a reminder that the most profound order often looked like chaos to minds that had forgotten how to trust the intelligence that operated through uncertainty and imperfection. In this trust, rest became possible, creativity flourished, and souls discovered that they had been perfect in their imperfection all along. Is the Harmony Keeper's crystal sanctuary. At the very heart of the valley where all the healing streams converged and all the guardian paths intersected, there stood a sanctuary built entirely from living crystal that pulsed with the combined energy of every healing that had ever taken place in this sacred realm. Its keeper was the most enigmatic of all the guardians, known simply as Unity, Whisper Harmony Keeper, whose transcendent gift was the ability to weave together all the separate threads of healing into a single seamless tapestry of perfect rest. The crystal sanctuary existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, its walls shifting between visible and invisible, depending on the needs of those who approached. Each crystal had been grown from a moment of perfect integration, instances when worry transformed into wisdom, when scattered attention gathered into presence, when isolation dissolved into connection, when chaos revealed its hidden order. Unity Whisper had been born into this role, rather than trained for it, arriving in the valley as an infant during a convergence of healing energies that occurred only once in several centuries. She had grown up, understanding intuitively what others spent lifetimes learning, that all disturbances to peaceful rest were ultimately variations on a single theme, the forgetting of one's fundamental wholeness and intrinsic okayness. On this night, as her fellow guardians completed their individual healing work throughout the valley, Unity, Whisper prepared for the most delicate and essential task of all, weaving their separate efforts into a unified field of perfect rest that would support not just individual sleep, but the collective healing of the entire community. She moved through her sanctuary with steps that honored the sacred geometry of integration, each footfall strengthening the crystalline matrix that would serve as the foundation for the night's culminating work. The sanctuary itself began to resonate with anticipation, its living crystals humming in harmony as they prepared to receive and amplify the healing energies that were beginning to converge from all directions. Through her consciousness, Unity Whisper could sense the completion of her colleagues' work rippling through the valley like waves meeting shore. Whisper Wind had finished transforming the garden soil of worry into the fertile earth of wisdom. Quiet Heart had guided the last restless minds safely through the stormy waters of anxiety into the calm harbor of stillness. Soft Sigh had synchronized every breathing pattern in the valley into the natural rhythm that supported cellular restoration. Gentle Page had completed her delicate work of memory transformation, helping souls release their death grip on unchangeable past events. Darkheart had finished guiding the Night's Seekers through the integration of their rejected shadows. Nowness had successfully gathered all scattered attention back into the eternal present where peace was always available. Flowing Calm had restored the healthy flow of life force throughout the valley's energy field. Heartbridge had rewoven the connections that reminded every soul of their fundamental belonging. Messy Beauty had liberated the perfectionists from their exhausting attempt to control the inherently uncontrollable. Now it was time for the great integration, the weaving together of all these separate healings into a unified field that would cradle the valley in perfect rest until dawn. This was work that required the deepest understanding of how consciousness operated at both individual and collective levels, how separate streams of healing could be merged without losing their unique qualities. Unity Whisper began by activating the central crystal of her sanctuary, a massive formation that had been growing for millennia and contained within its structure the essence of every peaceful sleep that had ever occurred in the valley. As the crystal began to pulse with awakened energy, she felt her awareness expand to encompass the entire community of sleeping and soon-to-be sleeping souls. The first integration was between the mental healings. Weaving together, Whisper Wind's transformed worry wisdom with Quiet Heart's guided stillness and Gentle Page's memory healing. These three streams of consciousness work flowed together naturally, creating a mental atmosphere in the valley that was simultaneously clear, calm, and free from the repetitive loops of anxiety and regret. Patricia, the marketing executive who had been struggling with perfectionist anxiety about her presentation, felt this integration as a profound settling of her entire thought process. The wisdom about good enoughness from Messy Beauty's workshop merged seamlessly with the release from memory replay that Gentle Page had facilitated and the present moment awareness that Nowness had restored. Her mind finally found the quiet space it needed for restorative sleep. Next, Unity. Whisper wove together the deeper healings, Darkheart's shadow integration with Heartbridge's connection restoration, and her own understanding of fundamental wholeness. This created a field of radical self-acceptance that reminded every soul in the valley that they were worthy of love and rest exactly as they were, with all their imperfections and contradictions intact. Thomas, the young artist who had been tormented by shame about his perceived inadequacies, experienced this integration as a profound homecoming to himself. The acceptance of his shadow aspects flowed together with the recognition of his fundamental connection to the web of existence, creating an unshakable foundation of self-compassion that would support not just tonight's rest, but all his future creative endeavors. The sanctuary's crystals began to sing in harmonious frequencies as the integration deepened, each one contributing its unique resonance to the growing symphony of healing. Unity. Whisper smiled as she felt the separate healing streams beginning to merge into something greater than the sum of their parts, a unified field that addressed every possible source of sleep disturbance simultaneously. The third integration brought together the somatic healings, soft-size breath regulation, flowing calms, energy rebalancing, and Nowness's present moment grounding. This created a foundation of physical peace that supported the mental and emotional healing that was occurring simultaneously. Elena, the nurse, whose nervous system had been overwhelmed by her demanding workday, felt this integration as a complete recalibration of her entire physiology. Her breathing energy, flow, and attention all synchronized into the natural rhythm of rest and restoration, while her understanding of her essential worthiness and connection provided the emotional safety that allowed her autonomic nervous system to fully relax. As the integration process continued, Unity, Whisper began to perceive something remarkable happening throughout the valley. The individual healings were not just existing side by side, but were actually amplifying each other, creating feedback loops of wellness that strengthened with each moment of deeper rest. William, the elderly widower, who had been struggling with loneliness, experienced this amplification as a sense of being held by the entire universe. His reconnection to the web of belonging merged with his acceptance of his grief as a form of love, while his present moment awareness helped him appreciate the peace that was available right now, even in the midst of his loss. The sanctuary itself began to glow with an otherworldly light as all the healing streams achieved perfect integration. This was the light of consciousness recognizing its own wholeness of separation, revealing itself to be an illusion of individual healing becoming collective transformation. Unity. Whisper felt the familiar awe that always accompanied this moment. The recognition that healing was not something that happened to individual souls, but something that souls did together as part of a vast intelligence that was always working toward greater harmony and integration. The fourth and most subtle integration brought together the temporal and spatial healings, weaving Nowness's present moment awareness with the expanded connections that Heartbridge had restored and the acceptance of natural chaos that Messy Beauty had facilitated. This created a field where beings could rest in the perfect uncertainty of existence, trusting the intelligence that operated through apparent disorder. Marcus, the construction worker, whose body had been tight with accumulated tension, experienced this integration as a profound release into flow. His muscles relaxed, not just because the physical knots had been unwound, but because he had rediscovered his trust in the natural processes that operated through his body, his life, and his place in the larger web of existence. As the night reached its deepest point, unity, Whisper began the final phase of her work, creating what the ancient texts called the seamless sleep, a state of rest so complete that it healed not just the individual, but contributed to the healing of the collective unconscious itself. The sanctuary's crystals reached full resonance, their combined harmonics, creating a frequency that matched the deepest level of restorative sleep. This frequency began to propagate throughout the valley, entraining every sleeping consciousness into the same beneficial brainwave patterns that supported cellular regeneration, memory consolidation, and spiritual renewal. Catherine, who had been replaying her argument with her daughter, found herself drifting into dreams where healing conversations took place effortlessly. David discovered that his worry about work mistakes transformed into dream scenarios where creative solutions emerged spontaneously. Sarah experienced dream sequences where perfect balance between all aspects of life revealed itself as a natural state, rather than an achievement to be forced. The integration was now complete, every soul in the valley resting in a state of such profound peace that their individual healing contributed to a collective field of wellness that would benefit generations to come. The valley itself seemed to exhale with satisfaction, its rivers flowing more smoothly, its trees breathing more deeply, its very earth settling into the rhythm of restored harmony. Unity Whisper felt the deep fulfillment that came with work aligned with cosmic purpose. The separate streams of healing had become a unified ocean of peace that would carry every soul safely through the night and deliver them refreshed to tomorrow's possibilities. The crystal sanctuary settled into its own rhythm of completion, its living walls pulsing gently with the combined energy of all the night's healing work. Each crystal continued to store the essence of this perfect integration, building a repository of peace that would be available to future souls who needed reminder of their fundamental wholeness. As dawn approached, Unity Whisper walked slowly through her sanctuary, appreciating the beauty of integration that had been achieved. 9 other guardians had contributed their unique gifts, and she had woven them into a tapestry of healing that would support the valley's inhabitants, not just through this night, but through all the nights to come. The valley rested in perfect harmony, every soul cradled in the awareness that they were exactly where they needed to be, exactly as they needed to be held by a love that had no conditions and supported by a wisdom that operated through apparent chaos to create ever greater wholeness. Patricia slept deeply, her presentation ready to unfold tomorrow with whatever perfection natural intelligence would provide. Thomas rested in the security of self-acceptance, his creativity freed to explore new territories without the constraint of impossible standards. Elena's nervous system restored itself completely, her capacity for caring supported by proper rest and renewal. William dreamed of his wife, not as someone lost, but as love that had changed form, while Jennifer discovered in sleep the unshakable knowing of her own worth. Marcus and Sarah, David and Maria and all the others throughout the valley rested in the peace that came from remembering their place in the great web of existence that could never reject or abandon them. The Harmony Keeper's crystal sanctuary stood as a testament to the truth that individual healing and collective healing were not separate processes, but different aspects of the same fundamental movement toward wholeness. Its living crystals continued to pulse with the rhythm of perfect integration, ensuring that the valley would always be a place where souls could find their way home to the peace that was their birthright. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities for growth, new souls in need of the gentle healing that the guardians provided, but tonight the work was complete. The valley slept in the perfect harmony that arose when all aspects of existence were honored, integrated, and loved exactly as they were. In the seamless sleep that Unity Whisper had facilitated, dreams and dreamlessness flowed together like streams meeting ocean. Individual consciousness and universal consciousness recognized their fundamental unity, and every soul rested in the peace that surpassed all understanding, the peace of knowing that they were always already whole, always already home, always already held in the infinite love that was their deepest nature. The 10 guardians' work was complete, and the valley slept in the perfect peace that was always available to any soul who remembered how to receive the gifts that love was always offering.